Greenland. It's been known for decades that Greenland Inuits, a culture whose diet is high in fish and other marine foods, have a low incidence of cardiovascular disease and death from heart disease. Unlike the modern Western diet, the Greenland Inuit diet is higher in omega 3 than omega 6, more than twice as high, actually. Omega 6 accounts for about 2% of their total calories, and omega 3 around 5%, for a 6 to 3 ratio of just 0.4. Recall that at 16 to 1, the ratio in the US is about as far from this as it gets. Between 1974 and 1976, the rate of death from ischemic heart disease among men aged 45 to 65 in the US was 40.4%, compared to just 5.3% in Greenland, 8 times less. Cardiovascular disease was also very low in Greenland, causing only 7% of all deaths compared to a whopping 45% in the US and Europe. In Japan, where omega 3 intake is higher than in the US and Europe, but lower than in Greenland, cardiovascular disease as a cause of death was somewhere between the two at 12%. Tellingly, the omega 6 to omega 3 ratios in tissue samples taken from these populations were 1 to 1 for Greenland, 12 to 1 for Japan, and 50 to 1 for the US and Europe. In other words, the higher the omega 6 to 3 ratio in people's bodies, the higher the rate of death from cardiovascular disease in those populations. This is due in large part to inflammation and to the effects of omega 6 and omega 3 on blood and blood vessels. After all, the heart is part of the cardiovascular system. It's not just things that go wrong with the heart itself that can lead to cardiovascular problems. Excessive omega 6 and insufficient omega 3 makes the blood more prone to clotting, which can contribute to heart attacks and strokes, and also makes it harder for blood vessels to dilate. Blood vessels aren't fixed shapes with rigid sides, like the pipes in your home's plumbing system. They're meant to expand and contract, dilate and constrict, in response to your body's variable needs for blood flow. Too much omega 6 and too little omega 3 makes the vessels more apt to tighten and constrict, forcing your heart to work harder to pump blood through them, which can result in high blood pressure, ruptured blood vessels, and other complications. Greenland Inuits who consume their traditional diet that is naturally high in omega 3s and low in omega 6s live in a very low inflammatory state. So it's no surprise that they typically have low rates of psoriasis, asthma, and other inflammatory conditions. Greenland Inuits are also known for their low rates of type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis, both of which are autoimmune disorders. Research indicates that omega 3s may be beneficial for other inflammatory and autoimmune conditions, such as inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, rheumatoid arthritis, and psoriasis. All this information tells us that populations with a low omega 6 to 3 ratio have a low incidence of chronic disease, and when this ratio increases, so does their rate of numerous chronic conditions, including things like psoriasis and rheumatoid arthritis, which can be painful and debilitating, but also cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, which are downright deadly. Japan. Moving on to Japan, the island of Okinawa is one of the blue zone regions and has some of the highest life expectancy rates in the world. In fact, at one time, Okinawans had the highest longevity, not just in Japan, but in the world. And they also enjoyed low rates of death from stroke, heart disease, and cancer. Prior to World War II, the Okinawans used animal fats, especially from pork, as their main cooking fat. But by 1990, these healthy and long-lived people had bought into the unfounded fears about saturated fats and were using vegetable oils for most of their cooking. Compared to people in other parts of Japan who consumed about 4 times as much omega 6 as omega 3, Okinawans consumed about 6 or 7 times as much omega-6 as omega-3. A Japanese researcher observed that rates of coronary heart disease, pneumonia, bronchitis, and lung cancer all increase as omega-6 to 3 ratio increase. The saturation of the Okinawan diet with omega-6 heavy vegetable oils and its eclipsing of omega-3 certainly took its toll on the longest living people in the world. By 1990, Okinawan men had dropped from the top spot down to 5th place for longevity among the Japanese. In the same year, while death from all causes in Japanese men over 70 was lowest in Okinawa, in men younger than 50, all-cause mortality was highest in Okinawa. In other words, the older generation who'd live most of their lives consuming a low dietary omega-6 to 3 ratio seemed protected, while those who were younger and had spent more of their lives on a high omega-6 diet were paying the price with shorter lifespans. The rest of Japan didn't fare much better. From the early 1900s until about 1950, the omega-6 to 3 ratio in Japan was no more than 3 to 1. By 1970, it had increased to 4 to 1, with linoleic acid intake tripling from around 4 grams a day in 1950 to 12 grams a day in 1970. Along with this increase in dietary omega-6 came increases in death from lung, colorectal, breast, prostate, pancreatic, esophageal, and skin cancers. The increase in death from lung cancer deserves a closer look. These are two main types of lung cancer: squamous cell carcinoma, which is typically due to smoking, and adenocarcinoma, which is not associated with smoking. More than half of lung cancer deaths in Japan are from adenocarcinoma, which suggests that something else besides smoking was increasing lung cancer deaths in Japan after 1950. Studies in animals indicate that corn oil, which is high in omega-6, promotes lung adenocarcinoma. In fact, high omega-6 oils in general, not just corn oil, have been shown to promote cancer growth in animals, whereas omega-3 fats seem to inhibit it. Remember, fats becoming signaling compounds in your body, and there are also structural parts of your cells that are constructed with the wrong kinds of fats coupled with too many pro-inflammatory signals and too few anti-inflammatory ones may contribute to malfunctioning at the cellular level, potentially resulting in cancer. A Japanese researcher summed it up pretty clearly. Omega-3 fats, ALA in vegetable oils, as well as EPA and DHA in fish oils, thus inhibit carcinogenesis, whereas linoleic acid and other omega-6 fats are stimulatory. Current levels of LA intake in industrialized countries, 6 to 8% energy, are at saturating levels with respect to cancer stimulatory activity. This is especially striking considering that, as we saw in Chapter 1, the American Heart Association recommends that we get as much as 10% of our total calories from linoleic acid. The Japanese researchers suggest consuming no more than twice as much omega-6 as omega-3, a recommendation precisely in line with our recommendations in this book. India. Let's journey west from Japan to India. India researcher S.L. Malhotra performed a study encompassing more than 1 million railway workers between the ages of 18 and 55, working in different parts of India for 5 full years. From 1958 through the end of 1962, during the study, more than 6 times as many railway workers from southern India died from heart disease as those from northern India, and rates of death from heart disease were also low in western and northeastern India. To add to the mystery, it wasn't just the rates of death that differed. The average age at death in southern India was 10 years lower than in the north. Another troubling finding was that, contrary to what we would assume based on our understanding of the effects of exercise and general physical activity on health and longevity, mortality was lower among the railway clerks with sedentary jobs compared to the railway workers with physically demanding manual labor jobs. And when separated by their job categories, mortality was 15 times higher among the manual laborers in southern India than those in the north, even though there were no differences between their ages or the amount of physical labor in their jobs. It's like a detective show. Where's the smoking gun? What's to blame for such a higher death rate in the south than the north? The researchers ruled out smoking, socioeconomic factors, and stress, having determined that they were not responsible for the dramatic differences in mortality. They also dismissed the total amount of fat in the workers' diets as a contributing factor. In northern India, typical fat consumption was 19 times higher than in the south, yet the rate of heart disease in the north was 7 times lower. These findings were corroborated by additional research published after the railway worker study. Malhotra found that between 1963 and 1964, the incidence of heart attack was over 7 times higher in southern India compared to northern India. Again, this wasn't caused by total fat consumption, because Indians in the north consumed as much as 19 times more fat than those in the south. The difference between was the type of fat. And the time the study was conducted, animal fats, including dairy, made up the majority of dietary fat in northern India, whereas seed oils were favored in the south. In the south, they had a very low fat intake, with most of it coming from peanut and sesame oils. Contrast this with the north, where fat intake was about 23% of total calories, and most of it came from ghee, milk fat, and fermented milk products, mostly saturated animal fats. Compared to various Mediterranean diets, which are generally 35 to 40% of calories from fat, the 23% of fat diet in northern India is fairly low. But while northern Indians consume 70 to 190 grams of fat a day, those in the south had an extremely austere diet of just 10 to 30 grams a day. So they may have had a low-fat diet up north, but it was high compared to what people were eating in the south, where the rate of death from heart disease was much higher. Malhotra noted that the seed oils favored in the south were about 45% polyunsaturated, mostly omega-6, compared to only 2% in the animal fats consumed in the north. Up north, Indians enjoyed yogurt, buttermilk, lassi, and other fermented dairy, but this was only a tiny part of the diet in the south. In the 1950s, death from heart disease was extremely rare in the north of India compared to the Western world. It's one of the lowest rates of death from heart disease ever recorded. Data from India from the 1950s and 1960s shows that residents of Delhi in the north had exceptionally low rates of coronary artery disease, CAD. In fact, they may have been the lowest in the world. They also had stunningly low rates of other forms of heart disease, as well as cerebrovascular disease, which includes stroke. In the 1950s, heart disease in Delhi accounted for 3% of all deaths. In Western countries, it was as high as 50%. At this time, Delhi was a veritable heart health paradise. Unfortunately, the detrimental changes that occurred in the Okinawan diet are mirrored in the diet of modern India. As late as the 1970s, India still had a lower incidence of CAD compared to many countries, as well as a low incidence of diabetes. For generations, the main cooking fats in the traditional Indian diet were ghee and coconut oil, which are both high in saturated fat, and rapeseed mustard oil, high in monounsaturated fat and omega-3. What all these fats have in common is a low total amount of omega-6 and a low ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. By the 1990s, however, almost all the traditional cooking fats in India were replaced with high omega-6 oils due to the promotion of vegetable oils for lowering cholesterol levels. The U.S. doesn't export just pop culture, unfortunately. It also subjects the rest of the world to its misguided nutritional science. The Indian diet was also low in EPA and DHA, but is used to be in the high omega 3 ALA alpha linoleic acid. Now, however, due to the prevalence of vegetable and seed oils, it's low in ALA and high in omega 6. The balance has shifted from an anti-inflammatory fat intake to a pro-inflammatory one. These days, the low-fat diet recommended in urban India calls for omega-6 to make up about 7% of total calories. And if the Indian guidelines are followed, omega-3 intake ends up being low, leading to an omega-6 to 3 ratio of about 20 to 1, a massively pro-inflammatory diet. The diet consumed by rural Indians has a 6 to 3 ratio of around 5 to 1, still high, but a major improvement over 20 to 1. Compared to urban Indians, rural Indians have a lower prevalence of almost all chronic diseases, especially type 2 diabetes and obesity. The fats consumed by the health-conscious urban elite are mostly seed oils that are marketed as heart healthy. The result of this is the omega-6 now makes up a whopping 19% of total calories, and these individuals are consuming an omega-6 to 3 ratio of about 50 to 1. In a more traditional Indian diet, such as that consumed in rural areas, omega-6 accounted for only 5.5% of total calories, and the omega-6 to 3 ratio was about 5 to 1. Approximately 90% of this fat came in the form of highly saturated ghee, with the remainder mostly from mustard oil. Researchers noted that in the high saturated fat diet before vegetable and seed oils wrapped their tentacles around the Indian populations, Indians had a low prevalence of diabetes. Areas with a high omega-6 diet, though, whether in urban or rural regions, had a higher prevalence of diabetes. The increase in the omega-6 to 3 ratio in the Indian diet paralleled the rise in numerous chronic diseases, but especially type 2 diabetes and obesity. Unlike their famously low rate of type 2 diabetes decades ago, India is now among the nations leading the world in diabetes incidence. And in a study in type 2 diabetics, researchers found that reducing total fat intake, particularly when the omega-6 to 3 ratio was markedly reduced, improved people's insulin sensitivity and reduced their need for medication to lower blood sugar. Indian researchers know the truth. It appears that Indians, in chasing the phantom of cholesterol, may have lost their rational fat intake pattern and are confronted with epidemics of insulin resistance disorders. The safety of using omega-6 oils in Indian cooking becomes a matter of serious concern. An interesting thing to note about these studies is that it wasn't enough just to supplement with a little bit of fish oil. Rich in omega-3s, EPA, and DHA, the magic wasn't solely increasing omega-3, it was in reducing omega-6 too, so that the ratio changed dramatically. And this was achieved by substituting vegetable and seed oils with more traditional Indian cooking fats, all of which are lower in omega-6. Kativa in Israel. A team of researchers headed by Stefan Lindenberg, a physician with an interest in nutrition and evolutionary biology, studied a population living on Kativa, part of the Trobriand Islands in Papua New Guinea. The Kativans eat a high-carb diet. 69% of their calories come from carbohydrates, with 10% protein and 21% from fat. Their total fat intake is relatively low, but the majority of this is saturated fat from coconut. A minuscule 2% of the calories come from monounsaturated fats, another 2% from polyunsaturated. The Kitavan diet consists of tubers, yams, sweet potatoes, and taro, fruit, coconut, fish, and vegetables, with negligible amounts of Western food and alcohol. They consume virtually no dairy, refined sugar, grains, or vegetable oils, and relatively little animal fat, except for that found in fish, which of course is high in omega-3. In Kativa, total fat is low, but saturated fat intake is high. In fact, all at 17% of their total calories, Their saturated fat intake is enough to make the policymakers at the American Heart Association gasp in horror. They consume more saturated fat that is recommended in the U.S., but unlike the modern American diet, the Katavan diet is extremely low in omega-6 and high in omega-3. Physical activity among the Katavans is slightly higher than in Western populations, but it's not especially high. Despite high smoking rates in Katava, stroke and heart disease are virtually absent. Here again, we have a population with a major risk factor for heart disease, smoking, yet they seem almost immune to it. If you ask the AHA, the smoking combined with their high saturated fat intake should make the Katavans ticking time bombs for cardiovascular diseases. And while they're more physically active than most in the U.S., they're not exactly doing triathlons every day. The deck is stacked against them, yet Lindenberg's group found them to be exceptionally healthy. Is there now also a Katavan paradox? When so many paradoxes start popping up, we have to ask ourselves whether these are actually paradoxes, exceptions that don't fit the rule, or if maybe our hypothesis or rule is wrong. Either saturated fat isn't bad for the heart, excessive omega-6 is bad for the heart, omega-3 is protective, or all three are true. Let's now examine Israel's fat experience. If LA, linoleic acid, is good for your heart, so good that the AHA recommends it should make up as much as 10% of all the calories in your diet, then you would expect a population with a high HLA intake to have exceptionally healthy hearts and blood vessels. But in Israel, you see the exact opposite. Israel has one of the highest intakes of LA, yet the population also has a high incidence of cardiovascular disease and hypertension. Rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity are also high. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease are all driven largely by chronic insulin resistance. There are other factors at work, but chronic insulin resistance is a major player in these conditions. This is also the smoking gun behind metabolic syndrome, a cluster of symptoms diagnosed by 3 or more of the following: abdominal obesity, a large waist circumference, high blood pressure, elevated fasting blood sugar, low HDL, or high triglycerides. So with their elevated rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension, Israelis should be on the lookout for metabolic syndrome. And if a high omega-6 diet is suspected to be at the heart of this, what might happen when people reduce their omega-6 intake? A study from Italy helps us answer this question. 90 patients with metabolic syndrome were instructed to follow a Mediterranean-style diet, while 90 others followed a prudent AHA-style low-fat diet. In the Mediterranean diet, subjects' intake of fruits, vegetables, nuts, whole grains, and olive oil was significantly higher than in the low-fat diet. The omega-6 to 3 ratio dropped from 11 to 6.7, still high, but a big improvement. People on the low-fat diet had virtually no change in the omega-6 to 3 ratio. Olive oil went up by the equivalent of about an extra tablespoon per day in the Mediterranean diet compared to an almost negligible change in the low-fat group. Omega-3 more than doubled in the Mediterranean group with almost no change for the low-fat dieters. So the Mediterranean diet had people eating more total fat, more omega-3, and less omega-6. And what happened? After 2 years compared to the low-fat group, which called for a diet that bears an eerie resemblance to the U.S. government's dietary advice, 50 to 60% carbs, 15 to 20% protein, less than 30% total fat, the Mediterranean group had a nearly 50% reduction in metabolic syndrome. Despite a higher fat intake, the Mediterranean dieters also lost more weight and had greater reductions in inflammation. And remember, compared to the low-fat diet, the Mediterranean dieters ate more fruit and whole grains. So this wasn't exactly a low-carb diet. This shows once again that obesity and metabolic syndrome aren't solely about carbs. It appears that changing the fats in your diet, specifically reducing omega-6, improves overall metabolic function, even without a big reduction in carbohydrates. This doesn't mean it's a great idea to gorge on bread and pasta, but a nice breakfast might be a bowl of full-fat yogurt with some berries and walnuts. Table 4.1 provides estimates of the dietary omega-6 to 3 ratios of some of the populations we've explored in this chapter. Table 4.1, estimated dietary omega-6/3 ratio. Population, Greenland Inuits, prior to 1960, 0.4. More recent, current day, unknown. Population, Japan, prior to 1960, 1 to 2. More recent, current day, 4. Population, India, rural, prior to 1960, 3 to 4. More recent, current day, 5 to 6.1. Population, India, urban, prior to 1960, 3 to 4. More recent, current day, 38 to 50. Population, United Kingdom, prior to 1960, 10. More recent, current day, 15. Population, Northern Europe, prior to 1960, 10. More recent, current day, 15. Population, United States, prior to 1960, 7 to 8. More recent, current day, 17. Inflammation and the omega-3 index. People typically pop an aspirin or an ibuprofen when they have acute pain and inflammation, a headache, a toothache, and menstrual cramps. One of the ways aspirin and ibuprofen work is by reducing the activity of enzymes that promote the formation of inflammatory compounds. EPA and DHA also inhibit these inflammation-causing enzymes. This doesn't mean a few omega-3 pills will magically take away your pain if you accidentally knock your shin into an end table, but it may mean that if you have enough omega-3 in your diet on a regular basis, you should reduce your risk for chronic illnesses that stem from rampant inappropriate inflammation, such as arteriosclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and inflammatory bowel disease. A good way to know whether you're getting enough omega-3 is your omega-3 index. The omega-3 index measures the amount of omega-3 fats in your red blood cells. It's expressed as a percentage of the total fats in your cell membranes. An optimal level is 8% or above, while below 4% is considered seriously deficient. And while we said earlier that the amount of certain fats in your bloodstream isn't always reflective of the amount of those fats in your diet, in the case of omega-3s, the correlation is quite reliable. With that in mind, the omega-3 index is typically inversely associated with inflammation. The higher the amount of omega-3s in your red blood cells, the lower their level of inflammation. Let's see how this plays out in your body. In a study of patients with peripheral artery disease, a condition involving narrowing of the arteries to the leg, stomach, or arms, which reduces blood flow to these areas and causes pain. Those with higher omega-3 indexes had lower markers for inflammation than those with the lower omega-3 indexes. Indeed, people with an average omega-3 index of 6.8% have much lower C-reactive protein levels, a marker of inflammation, than those with omega-3 indexes of 4.5% and 3.7%. The omega-3 index is also an independent risk factor for coronary heart disease mortality. The lower the omega-3 index, the greater the mortality, and in people with coronary artery disease, the index is inversely correlated with inflammation. Lower index, greater inflammation. Inflammation nation. The increasing omega-6 to 3 ratio in the Western diet has paralleled the rise in the incidence of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Recall from earlier that in general, omega-3 fats are building blocks for anti-inflammatory compounds, while omega-6 fats are building blocks for compounds that are pro-inflammatory. When you consume a balanced ratio of omega-6 to 3, 1 to 1 or close to this, your body is able to keep its normal, healthy, low level of controlled inflammation in check. Kind of like how the pilot light on your stove is lit all the time, but it doesn't burn the house down. But with so many omega-6 sparks adding fuel to the fire, people who consume a high amount of omega-6 without omega-3 are living in a constant state of rampant inflammation, triggering or exacerbating many of the health issues that top the list for causes of death or poor quality of life: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, chronic pain, hypertension, autoimmune disorders, and more.